My name is Eleanor Brandt. I'm 26 and I fix other people's machines for a living. Turbine sensors, the kind that warn a power plant before something fails. Funny work for the girl my family decided was the failure. 2 Saturdays ago, I drove 11 hours back to a town I'd sworn off, walked into my grandmother's memorial dinner, and set a cassette tape down on the table next to the casserole. 41 people in that room. My mother was mid-sentence, telling everyone how close she and Grandma Ruth had been at the end. She saw the tape. She stopped talking. Here's what nobody at that table knew. Grandma Ruth couldn't read or write past the 6th grade, but she could talk, and for the last 2 years of her life, she'd been talking into a $40 recorder I mailed her. The thing my mother tore up the night I left home at 18, the thing she swore never existed, was sitting in my hand, and Grandma Ruth had left instructions for exactly when to press play. My mother thought she'd buried 2 things that year: a daughter and the truth. She'd buried neither. If you've ever been the one your family kept around just close enough to blame, the one whose name comes up only when something needs explaining, stay with me. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to know who's in the room with me tonight. Because what happened at that table is going to take me a while to tell, and I need you to understand how a 60-second cassette tape undid 33 years of a lie my family had agreed to keep. Let me take you back to the house on Coal Run Road. We lived in Frackville, Pennsylvania. If you've never heard of it, that's the point of Frackville. A hair under 4,000, one stoplight that nobody suspects, a Catholic church and a fire hall, and a diner called the Anthracite, where the coffee tasted like the inside of a thermos no matter what time you got there. My father worked at a tire warehouse off Route 61. My mother kept the house, and in the front room, smelled like Bengay and butterscotch candies, sat my grandmother, Ruth Kovac, who had raised 3 daughters in that house and watched all 3 of them stay. That was the word, stay. In our family, it was almost a commandment. The Kovac women didn't leave. The oldest daughter especially didn't leave. She stayed close, she helped with the house, she married a man you could see from the porch. And she did not, under any circumstances, go off to some college to get ideas. My grandmother stayed. My mother, Carol, stayed. My aunt, Renata, stayed. And I was the oldest daughter of the oldest daughter, which meant tradition came down to me the way the recliner and the recipe tins and the chipped Hummel figurines were always going to come down to me. I wasn't asked to carry it. I was assigned it at birth. Let me tell you how that felt in the small ways, because the small ways are where you learn your place. My younger brother Daniel got a desk in his room. I got the kitchen table. After dinner, once the dishes were cleared, Daniel got driven to baseball 40 minutes each way. When I made the regional science fair, my mother said she'd see about the gas money. And then the morning came and the car needed an oil change, and somehow those 2 things were related. Daniel's report cards went on the fridge, mine went in a drawer, and when I asked once why mine didn't go up, my mother said, "Don't make everything a competition, Ellie." Like the fridge had been my idea. I want to be fair to her, even now, because Grandma Ruth taught me that fairness is the one thing you can keep, no matter what anyone takes. My mother wasn't a monster. She was a woman who'd been handed a rule and had decided somewhere along the way that the only thing was worse than the rule hurting her would be the rule not hurting me too. If she had stayed, I would stay. If she had folded herself small to fit this house, I would fold. There's a kind of cruelty that doesn't come from hate. It comes from someone needing you to lose the same thing they lost, so that their losing it can finally mean something. I didn't understand that at 16. At 16, I just knew I was good at one thing, and that thing was machines. But before I tell you about the machines, let me give you one more picture of how the house worked, because there's a particular kind of bookkeeping that goes on in a family like mine, and you only notice it if you're the one on the wrong side of the ledger. We had a chest freezer in the garage, and every fall my father and his brother would split a side of beef, and the good cuts went in first, on top, where you could reach them. The steaks, the roasts, and underneath went the rest. The ground, the bones for stock, the stuff you used when the good cuts ran out. I was 11 the year I worked out that this was also how my mother thought about her children. Daniel was on top. Daniel got reached for. I was the ground beef of that family, the thing you were grateful to have but never excited about, the thing you used up without ceremony. When Daniel got a B, he got taken to the anthracite for a hot fudge sundae. When I got a 98 on the county math exam, my mother said, "Don't let it go to your head." And that was the whole conversation, and I remember standing in the kitchen, holding the paper, and understanding that there was no grade I could get that would turn into a sundae, because the sundae was never about the grade. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because it's the soil the rest of this grew in. You have to understand how completely a family can decide who you are before you've had any say in it, so that you understand what my grandmother was actually up against, and what it cost her, at the very end, to undo it. And the strange thing, the thing that kept me confused for years, was that my mother wasn't lazy or stupid or careless. She was sharp. She could do the church accounts in her head. She could look at a casserole and tell you what was wrong with the seasoning from across the room. All that intelligence, and she spent it on the one project of making sure I never got further than she had. That's the part that took me the longest to forgive, and honestly, the part the tapes finally explained. You don't aim that much care at holding someone down unless holding them down is the only way you found to make your own staying mean something. It started with the furnace. We had an oil furnace in the basement that died every February, always at the worst possible hour, and a repairman from Pottsville who charged $80 just to come down the steps and tell us it was the igniter. The third winter this happened, I was 13, and I sat on the basement stairs while he worked, and I watched everything he did. The next February, when it died again, I went down with a flashlight and a screwdriver and Grandma Ruth's reading glasses, and I cleaned the flame sensor with a piece of emery cloth, and the thing roared back to life. My father came down in his undershirt and stared at the furnace like it had spoken Latin. "How'd you know to do that?" he said. "I watched," I said. He didn't say anything. He went back upstairs. But that night I heard him tell my mother, low through the floor, "She's got a head for it." And I heard my mother say, "She's got a head for a lot she's not going to use." That's the sentence I carried. She's got a head for a lot of things she's not going to use. My mother said it like a closed door. Grandma Ruth, it turned out, heard it like a dare. Here's the thing about my grandmother that the whole town got wrong. They thought she was simple because she couldn't read. She'd come up in a coal patch family in the 1940s, pulled out of school in 6th grade to mind the younger ones when her own mother got sick. And she never got those years back. She signed her name with a careful drawn shakiness, the way you'd copy letters in a language you didn't speak. The church ladies talked slow to her. The bank teller talked slow to her. And Ruth Kovac let them, because she'd learned that people tell you everything when they think you can't follow it. She followed everything. She was the one who noticed I'd stopped bringing books home because books got me labeled. She was the one who, when I was 15, pressed a folded 20 into my hand and said, "There's a library in Pottsville open till 8. Tell them you're at choir." She didn't read the books I borrowed. She just wanted me to have a place to put the part of me that didn't fit the house. And she was the one who, the spring I turned 17, sat me down in the front room while the rest of them were at Mass, and said something I have never repeated to anyone until now. "Eleanor, look at me." Her hands were folded over the Afghan, those big knuckled hands that had peeled 40 years of potatoes. "Your mother is going to try to make you stay. And she's going to do it because somebody made her stay, and that somebody was me." I didn't understand. I told her she was confusing herself. I'm not confused, she said. I'm 81, and I've never once been confused about this. I made a mistake with your mother that I have preyed on for 30 years, and I am not going to die having watched it happen twice. She reached into the side pocket of the recliner, the one I was never supposed to touch, and she took out a little tape recorder. The kind they sold at the drugstore for $10 with the orange record button. You're going to help me with something, and you're not going to tell anybody, not your brother, not your father, and God in heaven, not your mother. That was the first tape. I want to pause here because if you've ever had one person, just one, who looked at the part of you everyone else wanted gone and called it the best thing about you, then you already know what Grandma Ruth was to me. Drop a 1 in the comments if you've had a person like that. And if you haven't yet, stay till the end of this story, because I'm going to say something to you directly, and I mean it. Now, the tapes. It started small. Grandma Ruth couldn't write, so she'd never been able to leave anything behind in her own words. Everything anyone knew about her wishes, anyone had decided for her. My mother and my aunt Renata handling things, the way they handled the bank and the bills and the slow church ladies. So Ruth started talking into that recorder. At first it was just memory. Her mother's pierogi recipe, told out loud. The only way it had ever existed, the names of people in photographs nobody else could identify. The location of a war bond my late grandfather had bought in 1952 and never cashed. But somewhere in the second month it turned into something else. It turned into the truth about my mother. I'd sit on the floor by the recliner with my back against the heat register, and I'd change the tapes when they clicked to the end, and Ruth would talk with her eyes closed. And that's how I learned the thing that the whole rest of this story turns on. That's how I learned that in 1991, my mother, Carol Kovac, 19 years old, had been accepted to the nursing program at the community college over in Schuylkill Haven, with a scholarship that covered most of it, and had been 3 weeks from going. And my grandmother had stopped her. I told her the family needed her here, Ruth said, on a tape I have listened to more times than I can count. Renata was sick that year. Your grandfather's back was gone. And I told my own daughter that a girl who leaves is a girl who thinks she's better than her people. I watched her cry in the upstairs bathroom and I let her think that crying was weakness. A long pause on the tape, the sound of her breathing. It wasn't weakness. It was the last time that girl ever let herself want something out loud. After that, she got hard. She got hard the way a thing gets hard when you leave it out in the cold so it won't rot. And then she had you, and she looked at you, and she saw everything she'd buried. That's why she's the way she is with you, Eleanor. You're not her daughter. You're her own self, walking around free, and she can't stand the sight of it. I was 17, sitting on a heat register, and that was the day I understood my mother for the first time. Understanding her didn't make it stop hurting, but it changed the shape of the hurt. It went from a thing that was wrong with me to a thing that had been done to her first. We made tapes for almost a year before anyone found out. The night it fell apart was a Thursday in March. I was 18 by then, a senior, and I'd done a thing I hadn't told anybody. I'd applied to a 2-year program, applied science, instrumentation technology, the exact thing that made the furnace roar back to life, at a technical college near Williamsport. I'd taken the placement test on a Saturday. I'd said I was working, I'd gotten in. And not just gotten in, the financial aid letter said they were giving me almost the whole thing because of my test scores and because of a fund for first-generation students, a phrase I had to look up because no one in my family had ever been the second-generation anything. The letter came on a Thursday. My mother opened the mail at 4 o'clock the way she always did, and I came in from the bus at 3:40. And so for 20 minutes I had it, and I read it standing in the upstairs hall, and then I made the mistake that cost me 7 years. I left it on my dresser while I went down to set the table. She found it folding my laundry. I want to describe this exactly because the cruelty wasn't loud, and the people who hurt you most are almost never loud. She didn't yell. She was sitting on the edge of my bed when I came up, with the letter open in her lap and my clean towels stacked beside her, and she said, in a voice as flat as the folded towels, "When did you decide you were too good for us?" "I'm not too good for anybody," I said. "It's free. Mom, it's almost completely free. I'd come home, you'd what?" She stood up. "You'd leave. Same as all of them want to leave. You'd go up to Williamsport and learn to talk like them and come back and look at this house like it's something to be ashamed of." She wasn't crying. That was the worst part. I'd have given anything for her to cry. "This is not who we are, Eleanor." And then she tore the letter. Not in a rage. That's the thing people get wrong about my mother. She tore it slowly, in quarters, the way you'd tear a coupon you'd decided not to use, and she set the pieces on the dresser in a little stack, squared at the corners, and she walked out. I stood there a long time, and then I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was fix what was broken. I took the 4 pieces into the bathroom and I taped them back together with the Scotch tape from the medicine cabinet. My mother's tape, the roll she used to label her prescription bottles, and I sat on the cold tile and I read the taped-up letter 11 times. The scholarship sentence ran right across a text. I could still read it. "I want you to hold on to that tape. The Scotch tape. It comes back." Downstairs while I was on the bathroom floor, the phone was ringing. My mother had called my Aunt Renata, and within the hour, Renata was at our kitchen table, and my grandmother had wheeled herself in from the front room, and the 3 generations of Kovac women were sitting in judgment of the 4th. I came down at 8 and stood in the doorway. The torn letter, taped, was in my back pocket. "The oldest daughter stays," my aunt said, like reading it off a card. "There's a fund," I said. "There's a fund specifically for people whose parents didn't go. I'd be the first one in this whole family to what?" my mother said. "To leave your grandmother? She's 82. Who's going to sit with her, you? Or are you too busy with your machines? And here is the moment I will carry to my own grave." I looked at Grandma Ruth. I looked at her because she was the only one in that room who knew what I knew, who'd told me with her own voice on a dozen tapes that she would not let this happen twice. I looked at her to save me, and my grandmother looked at the table and said, "Quiet. The oldest daughter stays, Eleanor." The floor went out from under me. I didn't understand it then. I spent 4 years not understanding it. I thought she'd betrayed me, that all those tapes, all that I'm not going to die having watched it happen twice, had been an old woman talking, and when it counted she'd folded like everyone else. I went upstairs that night and I packed a duffel bag, 3 changes of clothes, my placement test results, a library copy of a thermodynamics textbook I never returned and still have, and $410 in babysitting money rolled in a sock. I left at 5 in the morning. The bus from Frackville to Williamsport left at 5:40. The only person awake was my father. He was standing in the kitchen in the dark, not drinking the coffee in his hand, and when I came down with the duffel he didn't try to stop me. He reached into his wallet and counted out $60. 3 20s, all he had, and he held it out and said, "Your grandmother would want you to have bus money." Which was a strange thing to say about a woman who just told me to stay. He didn't explain it. I took the money and I didn't say thank you, and I walked out the side door into a March morning so cold I could see the whole bus ride home in my breath, and I did not look back at the kitchen window, where I'm almost sure my mother was standing. I didn't speak to my family for 7 years. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, because here's where it turns, do me a favor and tell me in the comments. Was there a moment in your life when the one person you counted on seemed to let you down, and it took you years to understand why? I'll read every one. Now let me tell you what those 7 years held, because the silence wasn't empty. The silence was being built into something by an old woman who couldn't write her own name on the other end of a tape recorder. Williamsport was hard in the way that hard work is hard, which is to say it was the best kind of hard I'd ever had. I waited tables at a diner on the river from 5 a. till my first class. I lived with 3 other girls in an apartment over a laundromat, and the dryers ran so warm under the floor that we never paid for heat. I finished the instrumentation program in 20 months with the highest marks in my cohort and a professor named Dr. Alvarez, the first person who ever called me Miss Brandt instead of Ellie, recommended me for a maintenance apprenticeship at a power station downstate. I took the name Brandt, by the way, the spring I left. It was my grandmother's mother's name, the only thing of hers that had survived in the family Bible. I didn't want to carry Kovac into a room and have it mean stay. I wanted to walk in as someone who left, so I left the name, too. By the time I was 24, I was a calibration tech, making more than my father had ever made at the tire warehouse, traveling between 3 plants, certified on systems that most people in my field don't touch until they're 40. I was good. I'd always been good. The only thing that had ever been wrong with me was a family that needed me to be wrong. There's a thing that happens to you, though, when you build a whole life out of leaving. I want to be honest about it because I think some of you are living it right now. You get free, and the freedom is real, and it's everything you wanted. And then, around the 3rd year, you notice that you've organized your entire self around a single act of walking out a side door. Every decision I made by asking what the Frackville version of me would have done, and then doing the opposite. I didn't go home for holidays, but I also couldn't fully be anywhere else, because half of me was still standing in that kitchen, proving a point to people who weren't in the room. Leaving isn't the same as being free. I'd swapped a cage for a treadmill and called it a victory, and it took my grandmother, a woman I thought I'd left behind with everything else, to finally let me off it. But I'm getting ahead of myself because at 24 I didn't know any of the tapes existed yet, and the whole time the tapes kept coming. Not to me, I'd cut everyone off. But my brother Daniel, who was 14 when I left, and who I'd written off as just another one of them, Daniel had been visiting Grandma Ruth every Sunday. And Grandma Ruth, who couldn't write a letter, had kept right on talking into that recorder, and she'd told Daniel, "When the time comes, these go to your sister, not your mother. You understand me? Your mother does not touch these." And Daniel, God bless him, had hidden 2 years of cassette tapes inside the box spring of his bed. I didn't know any of this. I want to be clear. For 7 years I thought my grandmother had betrayed me. I built a whole life out of being right about that. She died on a Tuesday in October. 89 years old, in her sleep, in the recliner that smelled like Bengay and butterscotch. Daniel found me. He was 21 by then, working at the same tire warehouse our father had, and he tracked me down through the licensing board because that's a public record, and my brother, it turns out, is smarter than anyone in that family ever let him be. He didn't call. He sent a package. Inside was a Walkman, a stack of cassettes held together with a rubber band, and a note in my brother's handwriting that's only, "She told me you'd think she sold you out that night. She didn't. Listen to number 9 first, then call me." I played number 9 on the floor of my apartment with my back against the couch, and I heard my grandmother's voice, recorded. I worked out the date later, 11 days after the night she told me to stay. "Eleanor, if you're hearing this, I'm gone and you're a grown woman and you've spent some years hating me. That's all right. I earned that night." A breath, the orange button must have been close to her mouth. "Let me tell you why I told you to stay. If I'd stood up for you at that table, your mother would have fought me, and she'd have won, because it was her house and her daughter and her right. And you'd have stayed, and you'd have hated her, and that would have been the end of it. But if I let her win that night, if I let her think she'd kept you, then she'd let her guard down, and you'd be free. You got on that bus, didn't you? You got on that bus because nobody was watching you anymore. I didn't tell you to stay, child. I told you to run, and I made it look like the opposite so she'd never know which one of us to chase. I sat on that floor until the streetlights came on. There's one more thing, the tape said. I can't write a will. You know that. The lawyers want everything typed and witnessed and signed in a straight hand, and I've got none of that. But I asked the woman at the library, the nice one, the one who never talked slow to me, and she told me about a thing they call a holographic will. You write it yourself, by your own hand every word. And in this state, Pennsylvania, that counts. The law doesn't care if it's pretty. It cares if it's yours. Her voice cracked, just slightly. So I've been practicing my letters, Eleanor. 2 years I've been practicing. Renata thinks I've gone foolish sitting there with a pencil. I'm not foolish. I'm writing the only thing I'll ever write in my whole life. And it's about you, and it's in a tin in the cellar behind the canned tomatoes, the one with the rooster on it. And when they read what they think is the will at the dinner, you bring out hear me say it in my own voice. And you let them hear me say it in my own voice. I called Daniel. I was crying so hard he could barely understand me. He said, I know. I've heard it 40 times. Are you coming home? I almost didn't. Here's something nobody tells you about being the one who left. Going back feels like losing. 7 years I'd spent building a self that didn't need them. And the second I pointed my car at Frackville, I could feel that self getting smaller, like I was driving backward into the kid who got her report cards put in a drawer. I sat in my apartment with the keys in my hand for an hour. What got me into the car wasn't anger. I want to be honest about that, because the easy version of this story is that I went back for revenge, and that's not what happened. What got me into the car was a single line on tape number 14, the last one she ever made, recorded the week before she died, when her voice was so thin I had to play it 3 times to catch it. Don't do it for me, Eleanor. I'm past helping. Do it for the next one. There's always a next one. The next one. I knew exactly who she meant. My Aunt Renata had a granddaughter named Sophie, 9 years old, who liked to take apart the church's broken vacuum cleaner during coffee hour, and who'd been told, the last Christmas I'd heard about, that she had too many questions for a little girl. There's always a next one. The tradition doesn't end because the people who suffered it die. It ends because somebody refuses to hand it down. I drove 11 hours. I stopped once. The memorial dinner was at the fire hall. Because that's where you do these things in Frackville. Folding tables, a coffee urn the size of a water heater, casseroles in 9 by 13 pans, with the owner's last names written on masking tape on the bottom. My Aunt Renata had organized it. There was going to be a reading of Mother's wishes, after the meal, which I knew, because Daniel had told me, meant my mother and aunt reading out a list they'd written themselves and attributing it to Grandma Ruth. The bank accounts to Renata, the house to my mother, the personal effects to be distributed as the family sees fit, which was a phrase that meant me getting nothing and everyone agreeing that was correct. I walked in at 6:10. I had a canvas bag over my shoulder. Inside it, the Walkman, tape number 9, and the rooster tin from the cellar, which Daniel had pulled out the week before and not opened because he wanted me to be the one. The room did the thing rooms do. The talking stopped in a wave, starting near the door and rolling back toward the coffee urn. My mother was standing at the head of the long table, mid-sentence, telling a cluster of church ladies how she'd held Grandma Ruth's hand at the very end, how close they'd been, how her mother had told her she was the only one who'd ever truly understood her. She saw me. She saw the bag. I don't think she knew what was in it, but I think some animal part of her knew what it meant, because the color went out of her face the way it goes out of a sky before weather. Eleanor, she said, just my name, flat as a folded towel. Hi, Mom. My Aunt Renata stood up. This is a private family. I'm family, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I'd learned over 7 years that the quietest person in the room is the one everyone has to lean in to hear. I drove 11 hours. I'd like to sit down. Daniel got me a chair. My brother, 21 years old, in a shirt I could tell he'd ironed himself, pulled out a chair for me next to him and didn't look at our mother while he did it. And I have never loved anyone the way I loved him in that 1 second. I let them get through dinner. I want you to know that. I didn't ambush a room of grieving people over rigatoni. I ate my aunt's dry chicken, and I let the church ladies tell me I'd grown up, and I watched my mother not eat, watched her push food around a paper plate and glance at my bag every 90 seconds, and I waited. Then Renata tapped a plastic fork against a plastic cup and said, "Before we have cake, I'd like to share some of Mother's wishes." And I reached into the bag and set the cassette tape on the table. The click of it on the folding table was the loudest sound in the world. My mother looked at it and said too fast, "What is that?" "It's Grandma Ruth," I said. "It's her will." "Mother didn't have a will," Renata said. "Mother couldn't." And she stopped because she'd been about to say couldn't write, in a room full of people, about the woman we were burying, and even she had enough left in her to be ashamed of it. She couldn't write, I finished for her, quietly. For most of her life, that's true. The schools pulled her out in 6th grade to mind her siblings, and nobody ever taught her, and this whole family let her sit in a chair and talk to her slow for 60 years like she was simple. I looked around the table. She wasn't simple. She was the smartest person any of us ever met. She spent the last 2 years of her life teaching herself to write with a pencil in secret so she could leave one thing behind in her own hand. Aunt Renata, you thought she'd gone foolish with that pencil. She wrote you down. She wrote all of us down. I set the rooster tin on the table next to the tape. "This is a holographic will," I said. "Anybody can look it up." In Pennsylvania, a will written entirely in a person's own handwriting, signed them, is legally valid. No lawyer, no typist, no witnesses required. The law was practically made for someone like her. The court will bring in a handwriting expert to confirm it's hers, and it'll hold. Because every single word is hers, and there's 2 years of practice pages in this cellar to prove the hand. She knew that. The library lady told her. So before anybody reads anybody's wishes off a piece of notebook paper. I did not look at Renata's index cards, but everyone else did. "I think we should hear what Grandma Ruth actually wanted." In her own voice, since none of us bothered to ask while she was alive. My mother said, "Don't." It was the same word, the same flat tone she'd used the night she tore the letter. "Don't make everything a competition. Don't." And for the first time in my life, I understood that her don't was never a command. It was a plea. She wasn't telling me to stop. She was begging me not to make her hear it. I pressed play. The fire hall went so quiet you could hear the coffee urn ticking as it cooled. And then my grandmother's voice came out of that little speaker, thin and certain, filling a room that had spent her whole life talking over her. "My name is Ruth Anna Kovac. I'm writing this and saying this both, so there's no confusion. I am of sound mind. I know what I have and I know who I'm leaving it to." I watched my mother's hand find the edge of the table. "The house goes to Daniel," the tape said, and a sound went through the room, "not because I love him more. Because he's the only one who ever came on Sundays without wanting something. The war bond, the one your grandfather hid, is cashed, and it's a little over $9,000, and that goes to Renata, because she gave up a lot of years to this family and nobody ever said thank you. And I'm saying it now, Renata. Thank you. I should have said it 40 years ago." Renata started to cry. I hadn't expected that. I'd come in ready to hate her, and instead I watched a 63-year-old woman put her face in her hands at the sound of her mother thanking her for the first and last time. And to my granddaughter Eleanor, the tape said, "I leave the recipe tins, the Bible, and the truth." My mother stood up. "The truth," my grandmother's voice went on, gaining strength, "is that in 1991 I told my daughter Carol she couldn't go to nursing school because the family needed her. That was a lie. The family didn't need her. I needed her not to leave me, and I dressed up my fear as her duty, and I broke something in that girl that never healed. And then I watched her do the exact same thing to her own daughter, and I knew it was my sin coming back around, and I was too much of a coward to stop it at the table that night. So I stopped it the only way I could. Eleanor, if you're hearing this, you got out because I let your mother think she'd won. I'm sorry I couldn't do it cleaner. I'm sorry you spent years thinking I'd thrown you over. There wasn't a clean way. There never is in this family. We only know how to keep each other. My mother was standing now, with both hands flat on the table, and she was looking at me, and the thing in her face wasn't anger anymore. I'd been braced for anger my whole drive down. I didn't have a plan for what was actually there, which was a 19-year-old girl who'd been told she couldn't go, looking out of a 53-year-old woman's eyes. Hearing her mother admit on tape that the cage had been built out of fear and called love. Carol, the tape said, and my mother flinched at her own name in her mother's mouth. I owe you the most, and I waited the longest to say it. You were going to be a nurse. You'd have been a good one. You had the steadiest hands of any of my girls. I took that from you because I was scared of an empty house. And then you spent 30 years making sure your own daughter would never get I took from you. Because if Eleanor got free, then your whole life of staying would have been for nothing. I understand it, Carol. I'm the one who taught it to you. But it ends now. It ends with this tape. You don't have to keep paying for my mistake by passing it down. You can be the one who stops it. That's the only inheritance that ever mattered in this family, and I'm leaving it to you, if you're brave enough to take it. The tape clicked off. Nobody moved. 41 people in a fire hall, and the only sound was that cooling urn. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. The honest truth is I felt scooped out. Because I'd come down there carrying 7 years of a grudge against my mother, and my grandmother had just spent her last recorded breath refusing to let me have it. She hadn't handed me a villain. She'd handed me a woman who was hurt first and asked me, not in those words but I heard it, to be the one who broke the chain instead of just escaping it. My mother sat back down, slowly. She looked at the rooster tin and didn't reach for it. I knew about the nursing school, she said, not to me, to the table, to the air. I'd put it out of my head for 30 years, and the second I heard her say it, She stopped. Her jaw worked. I had the acceptance letter in a drawer for 3 decades. I used to take it out. I never told anybody that. She looked up and she found me, and for the first time in my life my mother looked at me like I was a person who'd happened to her, rather than a problem she'd been assigned. I tore your letter because I couldn't stand that you were going to get to keep yours. I know, I said. You taped it back together. I still have it. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite the other thing. Same tape, she said. I used to do that when I was a girl. I taped mine back together too after she gestured at the recorder, at her dead mother's voice still hanging in the room. Same roll of tape, probably. We never throw anything out in this family. And that was the moment. Not the tape, not the will, not the public reckoning. The moment was my mother and I realizing we had both 33 years apart, sat on a cold bathroom floor and tried to fix with Scotch tape a thing that someone who loved us had torn in half. We'd been the same person the whole time. The only difference was that one of us got on the bus. I reached across the table and I opened the rooster tin. Inside was a stack of notebook paper, the lines crowded with big, careful, shaking letters. A woman's whole literacy, learned at 87, spent entirely on us. On top, in a separate envelope, was a single sheet, and when I unfolded it, I saw it wasn't part of the will at all. It was addressed in that same painstaking hand to Sophie. The next one, 9 years old, too many questions for a little girl. It said, and going to read it the way she wrote it, because I'm not going to clean up Ruth Kovac's spelling for anybody, Sophie. You like to take things apart. Don't let them tell you that is bad. Things has to come apart so you can see how they work. People too. Love your great-grandmother Ruth. I handed it to Renata to give to the girl. And I watched my aunt read it, and I watched her understand that her mother had thought about her granddaughter's small, stranger gift in the last weeks of her life, and had wanted to protect it, and I watched a second chain start to come loose right there at the table. I stayed 3 days. I'd like to tell you my mother and I fell into each other's arms and wept and healed everything. We didn't. That's the AI movie version, and you've earned better than that. What happened was smaller and truer. On the second day, she came out to the driveway where I was checking my oil before the long drive back, and she stood there a while not saying anything, and then she said, "I would have been a good nurse." And I said, "Grandma said you had the steadiest hands," and she said, "I do, I still do." And then she went back inside. That was it. That was the whole reconciliation. But I'll take a true small thing over a fake big one every time. And so would you, if you've ever actually had to repair something in study, instead of just forgiving them in your head. Daniel got the house. He's turning the front room, the recliner's gone, but the heat register's still there, into a little workshop. He says Sophie comes over on Sundays now and they take things apart together. The vacuum cleaner. A clock radio. Last I heard, a lawnmower engine. My mother enrolled in a certified nursing assistant course at the same community college that had accepted her in 1991. 53 years old, in a classroom with kids a third her age. She failed the first practical and passed the second. She mailed me the certificate. There was no note. There didn't need to be. I framed it next to my own tipped-up letter, the two of them, side by side on the wall over my workbench. 2 pieces of paper that somebody tried to tear in half and somebody else taped back together. I kept the tapes, all 14 of them. I had them digitized, and I sent Daniel and my mother and Renata each a copy, and I kept of the originals in a fireproof box, because they're the only place my grandmother's voice still exists, and the only place this family ever told itself the truth. I learned something in that fire hall that I'd been getting wrong my whole life. I'd thought the people who hold you back are your enemies. I'd thought the only way out was to leave them behind and never look at them again, the way I'd left the name Kovac at a bus station. But the woman who set me free wasn't a stranger who believed in me. She was the same woman who'd caged my mother. She'd just lived long enough and gotten brave enough to undo her own worst thing before she died. The chain and the key were the same hands. Respect isn't something you're owed because you share blood with someone, and it isn't something you earn by becoming impressive enough that they finally have to admit it. Respect is what my grandmother did with a $10 recorder and a pencil and 2 years of practicing her letters. It deciding that another person is theirs, fully theirs, and that the worst thing you can do to someone you love is need them to stay small so you don't have to feel alone. She decided that. At 87, after getting it wrong for 50 years, if she could change that late with that little, then none of us get say it's too late or we're too far gone. There's always a next one. That's what she told me. The tradition doesn't die when the people who suffered it die. It dies when one person looks the kid taking apart the vacuum cleaner and says, "Ask all the questions you want." Things have to come apart so you can see how they work. People too. A note before you go, because I think some of you needed this story tonight, and I don't want to leave you with only a story. The legal thing in this, the holographic will, the handwritten will that let a woman who couldn't type leave her wishes in her own hand, that's real. In about half of U.S. states, including Pennsylvania, a will written entirely in your own handwriting and signed by you can be legally valid with no lawyer and no witnesses. The rules differ a lot from state to state, and a handwritten will is genuinely harder to prove and easier to contest than a properly drafted one, so please don't take estate planning advice from a story on the internet. If someone you love is older, or can't easily read or write, or has just never had anyone sit down and ask them what they actually want, sit down and ask. Don't decide for them. If you need real help, the Elder Care Locator, run by the U.S. Administration on Aging's, is free and connects families to local support at 1-800-677-1116. And if your family is the kind where one kid quietly got the message they were less, if that kid was you, the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233 handles emotional and family abuse, too, not just the physical kind, and they will talk to you about exactly the thing you've never had words for. I'm not a lawyer, I fix sensors. I just wanted to tell you about a woman who learned to write her own name at 87's so that her granddaughter could stop carrying a lie that wasn't hers. If you've got a person in your life who needs you to stay small so they can feel safe, you're allowed to get on the bus. And if you're the one who's been keeping somebody small, it is not too late to be the one who stops it. My grandmother proved that with a pencil. If this reached something in you, share it with the person it made you think of. You know who they are already. Tell me in the comments, who was your Grandma Ruth? Who saw the part of you everyone else wanted gone and called it the best thing about you? I read every single one. And if nobody's ever been that person for you, let me be the first. The thing they keep telling you to put away, that's the best thing about you. Don't let anyone tape it into a drawer. I'll see you in the next one.